Evet, yayınımıza devam ediyoruz inşallah.
They have raised our lives so well. So the PKK will have no more morale. The PKK has nothing to do, and we have coming generations.
Bir daha göreyim. Gece gündüz çalıyoruz Mehter Marşı'nı. Bak Aslanlar'da birkaç gündür üst üste çaldığımız Mehter Marşı'nın suyla çok güzel.
People would like to live in peace and security, but there are certain hypocrites that try to bring troubles upon the believers. For instance, when we look at the British deep state, they just throw bombs on people, they just bombard certain places, they just try to spread homosexuality, they try to propagate Darwinism. And people have no intentions to be perverted like this, but they try to make propaganda for homosexuality, for Satanism up to their own minds. And these are the hypocrites, actually. They have this kind of an evil incitement. This is mentioned in the Quran. They always try to stop auspicious things, benevolent things, but they want to take the time of Muslims. They want to take times of believers with empty efforts, with vain efforts. This is what the hypocrites try to perpetrate against Muslims, against believers.
Mesela bak biz samimiyiz. Ama mesela buraya bir münafık hücumu olsa Allah esirgesin. Bura cehenneme döner. Yani huzursuz edecek ne varsa.
But may God forbid, if hypocrites were to come here, this place would be like hellfire. Their way of speaking is not proper. Their attitudes is not proper. The hypocrites only bring trouble. The hypocrites always try to cause unrest and turmoil. For example, you would stand here.
Ona kafayı takar. Onu düzeltesin dediğini yaparsın. Başka bir şeye kafayı takar.
The hypocrite would just pick on a certain thing. The hypocrite would like to change its position. Then the hypocrite would just try to pick on something else. Because the hypocrite is so much at unrest. The hypocrite causes for disturbance. That is the same in the communists. They want to look for conflict because they claim that there is thesis, antithesis, and that would lead into a synthesis. And the communists always look for conflict. That is their ideology. And we see that the same conflict occurs in revolutions and wars in the communist ideology. And that is the same case with the hypocrites. Do you know Kate Upton?
Bir göster bakayım.
Let us show her. This is Kate Upton.
Она как твоя сестра, вы настолько сильно похожи с ней.
Benziyor değil mi?
She looks like your sister.
Говорят, что я похожа на какую-нибудь актрису и достаточно
You look like her.
внешности.
Beni pek çok Hollywood yıldızlarına benzetiyorlar. Herhalde yüz hatlarımdan dolayı.
Kalpler ancak Allah'ın zikriyle ferah buluyor. Münafık başka şeylerle kalbini ferahlatmak ister.
Hearts find comfort and security in the remembrance of God, but the hypocrite just tries to find some other things. But when the hypocrite does not seek ways to find comfort and security and goodness by remembering God, the hypocrite tries to find some other ways. For instance, the hypocrite goes to a movie, and that movie would turn out to be trouble for the hypocrite. Or if the hypocrite would go out on the streets, every step that the hypocrite would make would turn out to be against him. Or maybe the hypocrite would try to do sports, but that would turn against the hypocrite also. Because the only way to find relief and peace in the heart is with God's remembrance. That is the only way. Yes, I'm listening to you. Today in Diyarbakır, Hakkari and Cizre, our Kurdish brothers have just stood against terrorism by means of a huge raid. They said Turks and Kurds are brothers, but the PKK terrorists are perfidious and they are traitors. These were the slogans that our people just threw in the streets of Diyarbakır. These are the photographs of this huge rally bringing together the Turkish people. And I'd like to show a video.
Evet, çok güzeldi. Yani tabii daha önce de söylemiştim. Bu tip olaylarda sağ alabildiğine tırmanışa geçer. Yani
This is really so beautiful. I have told this before.
Yani bu tip suikastler olsun, işte bombalar.
In such attacks, in such assaults, when we see that there are PKK attacks, when there are assassinations or explosions, we see that the Turkish people, the entire nation, are more bonded together strongly, and they just incline towards the right wing, and this reinforces the integrity, the unity of our people. So there's always goodness as an outcome of such assault, such attacks. But I have so much love for God. I have so much love for my state, for my nation. But let me tell them that this is not the way to attain salvation. Because we know that there is a philosophy which is in denial of God. That is Darwinism, the evolutionary belief. That is in denial of God. That Darwinism claims that the entire universe, animals, all living beings, plants, occurred as a result of coincidences. By means of a conflicting process, as a result of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and the evolution theory claims that all the living beings and the entire universe came out of coincidences. That is definitely a slander, a defamation against God. And that is definitely a challenge against God. And God is never pleased with this. God dislikes such denial. So let us eradicate this religion of the British deep state, because they have just invented this religion, Darwinism, as the religion of Satan. And people have been following this false belief system of Darwinism. We know that the collapse of Darwinism and the unity of the Islamic world will bring salvation. The only way to attain salvation from out of all these troubles is only with the eradication of the Darwinist belief and also the union of the Islamic world. I just heard one of our friends, one of our brothers, Turkish citizens, just speaking on the TV, and he was saying that none of the communists would come out with such explosives, and he claimed that only ISIS would be just perpetrating such attacks with suicide bombs. Well, actually, his words is just a kind of a directive leading the masses against the Muslims. I don't believe that he just spoke these words deliberately. Maybe he was offended. But a communist, Stalinist, a PKK terrorist, he would never want to live. He doesn't want to remain alive. Why should they not commit suicide like that with suicide bombs? Because, for instance, we see that hundreds of people all together, they starve themselves to death. And when there's an incident, that person puts himself on fire and he commits suicide like that. This is what we see in the communists. For instance, the police calls them to surrender. They don't surrender. So although they know that they would be killed, they just commit suicide. They enter into confrontation with the police force, and in the end they get killed. And This person who was speaking on the TV, he claimed that the communists would not commit such suicide bomb attacks. Well, I'm just talking about the PKK terrorists, really, because there could be people with communist ideology and who would be just resorting to democratic ways to come to power with political means. And he clearly states that those people have communist ideology. I would find those persons to be my brothers because, for instance, a person is a member of the Turkish Communist Party, and he says that he's never violent, but he tries to convince people with communist ideology, and this is how they just try to come to power. But that is not the case with the PKK, because we see that the PKK terrorists are communist and Stalinists, and they are just prepared to commit suicide. For instance, when they enter into this kind of a conflict, a confrontation with the Turkish armed forces, the soldiers, they would never surrender, because if they would surrender, their lives would be saved. But despite that, they just shoot and attack the soldiers with weapons, and they just resist for hours, and in the end, they get killed. So there's no logic claiming that communists would not commit such suicides. His way of speaking is not reasonable, because he's been offended with the Turkish state. It is apparent that this person has met with certain people in the PKK, and he wants to have their sympathy. These are not reasonable words. What are you doing, really? What would you like to do? That is a major error. And this is definitely a very illogical claim, because he states that PKK terrorists would not commit suicide. On the contrary, in all their confrontations, we see that they are committing suicide. This occurs on the streets. They have entered into this kind of a confrontation with the police force, and they were just surrounded by special operations unit members and police force, and in the end, both of those PKK terrorists were shot. And they got killed.
Mesela 1980 ve 1990 arası en çok intihar saldırısı düzenleyen örgüt komünist Tamil gerillaları.
For example, between 1980 and 1990, it was the communist Tamil guerrillas that committed suicide attacks. They just killed Rajiv Gandhi by means of suicide attacks. Actually, these are the communists who have been perpetrating such attacks. And that was the same case with PKK terrorists in the same period. Between 1994 and 2004, there have been 16 suicide attacks by the PKK terrorists. So just claiming that only Muslims would perpetrate such suicide attacks is really lack of knowledge, or how can I describe this? Well, maybe that is because of being misdirected. How could you just claim that Muslims would act like this as if they are so much fond of committing suicide? Because in Islam, suicide is haram. Committing suicide is unlawful. So there's no reference that he would base his opinion on. Where did he get that kind of an idea? For example, in Lebanon, we know that the first terrorists who committed suicide attacks were the communist women guerrillas. In the civil war in Lebanon, the Ba'ath Party, the Syria Ba'ath Party, the communist Palestinian terrorist organizations, they all just used this method, suicide attacks. And these are the communist organizations that have just implemented suicide attacks. And a communist terrorist just carried out a suicide attack against the Russian Tsar. And similar methods were applied in the Chinese-Japanese war. And during the Soviet invasion, none of those Afghan soldiers, they never perpetrated such suicide attacks. For that reason, just trying to put the blame on the Muslims is really not reasonable. I don't want to use harsh statements because I believe that this person who gave his opinion on TV lacked proper knowledge, he was ignorant. This is a wrong idea. Sometimes communist guerrillas, PKK terrorists, they enter into the police station and they attack the Turkish soldiers trying to suffocate them with wire, for instance. So some kind of spray gases should be used to neutralize those PKK terrorists if they were to attack the police force in the security stations, because they just break down the doors of police stations. They enter in order to attack the police force. So the Turkish soldiers, they should be provided with masks to secure them. And if PKK terrorists were to carry out such assault against the police stations by entering through the door, breaking down the door, they should be sprayed with gases, with various gases, to deter them, because they would just try to find ways to run away, because they wouldn't be willing to be impaired by such gases. So some gases that would be impairing their respiration, that would cause disturbance, various gases could be used to neutralize those terrorists if they would attempt to enter into police stations. I don't know the exact chemical composition of those gases, so there could be various ones, and those could be used to deter PKK terrorists. So I'm just telling this person, he should not be cross, he should not be offended with the Turkish state. The Turkish state was aware that there were certain structures which were turning against the Turkish state. For instance, there was the counter-guerrilla, and they started selling narcotics. And they tried to turn against us. They tried to plot against us. And because of that reason, at that time, God sent all kinds of troubles upon the counter-guerrilla force. I don't believe, I'm not sure if they had any legal status, but the counter-guerrilla at that time, that force was just taking part in narcotic sales, and for that reason the Turkish state intervened. If you were not doing that yourself, the state had to carry out a wholesale approach. The state wanted to eradicate the entire system. So there is no need to be offended with the Turkish state. Because we just saw before how they were so evil in their actions. I'm an anti-communist, I'm an anti-Stalinist. I'm just fighting against the PKK terrorism. Why would you ever carry out such assault against me? There were certain people who were a part of the counter-guerrilla force at that time. And when the Turkish state, they realized that there were such unreliable people, evil people in that organization, for that reason, the state was harsh on them. And if that is not a legal organization, definitely the Turkish state had the right to topple them down. Women are so beautiful beings. How can they not appreciate women? What happened to the world? In my childhood years, I was thinking that people would have love for one another. I imagined that people would have love for women, but I just encountered a terrible hypocritical system. People have been so distant to God, and they have just given themselves into this Darwinist system. And Satan is just laughing, just ridiculing the entire humanity. How could how could an adult person believe in coincidences? How could they believe in this chance?